I think everybody here has the rundown of it's available online and all that thing. But, if you do need to miss one, feel free to go online and check them out. Thank you to Chase for filming us. So again, my name is up there, email is up there if you have any questions or thoughts afterwards. Sorry? The name in Navarre?
Your last name.
Yeah, it's kind of French Basque. Yeah, it actually may come up again today. So today is the third of 5. It says Reformation up there. What we're going to do today is kind of approach the Reformation. We might just kind of stumble into it a little bit. But next time we'll kind of talk about the results of the Reformation and how Protestantism wound up splitting into many directions. So last time we just kind of ended by mentioning the Great Schism, so that's kind of where I want to start today. This is 1054, but I'm going to take a step back just for a very brief second. I promise it won't be long, back to Constantine. In 330, Constantine moved the imperial capital to Byzantium, which then became Constantinople, which is now Istanbul. So why did he move? At the time, Rome was kind of a mess, and Byzantium was really the up-and-coming place. It was extremely strategically important in a way that Rome never was. You can kind of see Rome there on that peninsula. It was useful in Rome to kind of get to Africa and whatnot, and that was important in earlier times. But a lot of the action was happening either out to the east or up to the north. Out to the east, you have a long distance of water and mountains once you get onto the Greek peninsula. Going north, you have the Alps. If by moving to Constantinople, he was a little bit more in the action of the day. See if I can do this here. Another factor is the Danube. The Danube River flows north of the Alps into the Black Sea. And so communication was actually better in Constantinople to the northern Germanic wars and things that were happening up there, because they could just float down the Danube, than it was in Rome, where they had to cross over the Alps. So it was just a real appealing thing for him to kind of be more in the center of the action. Another factor was Persia. Persia was one of the main enemies at that time, and that's kind of lower right-hand corner of the map. So Constantinople was a lot easier to kind of keep an eye on what was going on there, and again, communication was much faster. At this time, it was also a richer place. They were wealthier, and there were probably more Christians there than there were in Rome. So with the transfer of political power, the church leaders in Constantinople kind of thought, well, that means a transfer of the primacy of the church. They thought, okay, now we're in charge. Rome did not agree. So that is kind of some of the seeds that were planted 600 years earlier for the Great Schism. When we get to 380, this guy, Theodosius the Great, he made Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. Constantine allowed Christianity, but it was Theodosius who made it the official religion of the empire. However, when he died, it divided the empire. And so this was something that happened throughout Roman history. When an emperor died and there was no one single agreed upon successor, then very often it divided into like various sons or other people into chunks. In some cases it divided into 2, in other cases it divided into more than 2. But at this time it divided into 2. And this became a fairly ingrained thing throughout history. Once this one happened, it kind of stayed that way to a very large extent. There were times things kind of came together or not, but for the most part, this was the divide that lasted. So you can kind of see on that map, Constantinople is in that little chunk right there. So it's right in the center of that Eastern Empire. Yeah?
I read somewhere that Trier in Germany was once capital, was it? Or of the western portion.
Yeah, that gets complicated, and I'm not sure I have the definitive answer. Okay. They certainly built palaces there. And you can see to this day a palace of Constantine in Trier. Yeah. And it's really interesting. I mean, Trier is a fantastic place. But I don't know that I would ever say that that was the center of the Roman Empire, but it was definitely important. Let's see here. So I'm going to kind of fast forward through the next 600 years. A ton of stuff happened. We could spend an awful lot of time on it. One really important thing is the fall of Rome. That happened during this period. But it was interesting, when Rome fell, the religion was not displaced. As a matter of fact, the people who took over Rome eventually converted to Christianity. So there was kind of continuity of the church in Rome, in spite of all of the upheaval there. So let's move to 1054. Now, the church had lots of stresses between East and West throughout this period, all the way from Constantine up to 1054. Lots of arguments about doctrine, lots of arguments about who is really in control of the church. The Romans always felt that they were definitely the direct descendants from Peter. They should be the number one. They said, okay, we're equal, but we're the first of the equals. And again, because Constantine had moved to Constantinople, they felt that they deserved to be number one. So they never really got along, but they never completely broke apart. There were times when things were really, really stressed, but they never made a final break. What happened in 1054 was Michael I Cerularius is the Patriarch of Constantinople. He's the guy sitting on the throne on the left. And Pope Leo IX, they kind of got into a little tit-for-tat war here. Some people say it started when Pope Leo IX said that all of the Greek churches on the Italian peninsula need to become Latinized. They need to follow the way things are done in the Roman church. So basically, churches were forced to either kind of change how they did things, or they were disbanded. That caused the Patriarch of Constantinople, the guy on the left, to basically do more or less the equivalent thing in Constantinople with all of the Latin churches. So there were churches kind of from the different traditions who were in the opposite camp. So they were all either removed or changed. So that tit for tat caused an escalation where both sides excommunicated the other side. So believe it or not, that had happened before. That wasn't the first time that they excommunicated each other, not that those two particular people, but the people in those roles. But this time it stuck. And that caused the schism that exists to this day. Just a quick note about the Pope and the Patriarch of Constantinople. They're really the same word, Pope or Patriarch. I mean, they're basically saying father. And the official title of the Pope starts, it's big, long, I won't read the whole thing, but it starts with Bishop of Rome. His title doesn't start with something popish, he's a bishop. So the reason he is the head of the Roman Catholic Church isn't that particular position was some specially created, elevated thing. It's just the Diocese of Rome was the most important in Christianity according to them, so therefore whoever the bishop is there is the most important. And it's kind of a similar thing with the Patriarch of Constantinople. They didn't use the Pope word, they used the word Patriarch, but it was basically the same thing, and he's basically the Bishop of Constantinople. So that's kind of the background there. So from the Roman Catholic view, the Pope is the successor of St. Peter. They draw a direct line back to St. Peter. So as they were kind of going through this fight, Rome insisted that the Patriarch recognize the Pope as head of all churches. That didn't happen. It kind of set into stone these divisions between East and West. Now there are doctrinal divisions between Orthodox Christianity and Roman Catholic Christianity. You'll see some people who are going to argue that it was those doctrinal issues that caused the schism. I tend to think it had a lot more to do with the politics and just who was in control. But certainly the doctrinal issues made it much more difficult for them to try to reconcile. When they divided in 1054, there was an expectation that eventually they would reconcile, but they never did. They're still separate today. So the pieces that are really in conflict then and to a large extent now are the position of the Pope, whether the Pope or the Patriarch is fallible or infallible on matters of doctrine, unleavened bread, whether that should be used or not, or whether it must be used or not, and then the big one, filioque. So that's a concept that has to do with our creed. So this is from the ELCA website. And we have the Nicene Creed here. And what's interesting or the relevant here is the second part. So in our creed it says, we believe in the Holy Spirit, the Lord, the giver of life, who proceeds from the Father and the Son. And you'll notice there's an asterisk there. We'll get back to the asterisk in a minute. So in the Eastern Church, they do not include that phrase. So you can kind of see, it's a little blurry, but you can kind of see in this diagram. In the Eastern Church, you have the Father, and you have the Son proceeding from the Father, and the Holy Spirit proceeding from the Father. In the Latin Church, which is our tradition, we have the Father, the Son proceeding from the Father, the Holy Spirit proceeding from both the Son and the Holy Spirit. So what's interesting, and this is where the passage is that the Orthodox Church hangs its hat on in terms of why they don't add that other phrase. John 15:26, when the Advocate comes, whom I will send to you from the Father, the Spirit of truth who comes from the Father, he will testify on my behalf. It doesn't say anything about the Son there. From the perspective of the church, the Western Church at the time, and even up until this day to a large extent, I think there's a lot more squishiness on the Western side than there is on the Eastern side. The Western side is kind of like, yeah, okay, we kind of see your point, and the Eastern side is, we don't see your point at all, you're wrong. Interestingly, the ELCA has made a lot of strides in working with the Orthodox Church in kind of finding common ground, and by common ground, it's the ELCA kind of moving much more closely to the Orthodox position. They put out a statement about 20 years ago now that says that phrase, "and the Son," was added to the Nicene Creed unilaterally by the churches of the West around the 11th century. It has been a source of division between the churches of the West and the Eastern Orthodox churches since the formal break between them in the year 1054, what we're talking about. The common statement says that, so they made a common statement, the ELCA and the Eastern Orthodox Church, and it says that it's appropriate, particularly in ecumenical conversations and worship, to confess the Nicene Creed without the phrase, because the creed was originally adopted without it. In addition, the Lutheran World Federation has said, is it appropriate to cite the Nicene Creed without the phrase? And so now we go back to that ELCA page, and we look at the little asterisk there. And so the asterisk says, or who proceeds from the Father. The phrase, "and the Son," is a later addition to the creed. So we still say it at the moment, but it feels like there's a little thing in the wind that says maybe someday ELCA might possibly drop that. It's a really interesting topic, and we could go for a very long time on it. There is an argument that says that proceeds from the Father and the Son is just kind of a logical extension of our understanding of the Trinity. And so while it wasn't in the original creed, it still makes sense. I don't want to get too bogged down in that. There are other people who are basically, as far as I'm concerned, kind of gaslighting us and just say, no, it was there. They're wrong. It was there from the beginning. I don't think there's any evidence to show that that's true, but there are people who definitely say that. So if you're curious, this is Bartholomew I. He's the current patriarch of the Eastern Orthodox Church. At this time, there's about 1.34 billion Catholics, 1 billion Protestants, and, oh, interesting, it cut off. About, I think it's about 270,000 Eastern Orthodox. So the Eastern Orthodox Church, of course, has had incursions from Islam and whatnot that really reduced the numbers quite a bit from those days. Good place to just take a moment. Is there any questions or thoughts so far about that? If not, I will continue. So I want to talk just a minute about religious orders in the Catholic Church. And I'll explain why in a minute, but just, there's a lot of religious orders. We can't possibly go through them all, but just a few of the more well-known ones. This is Benedict of Navarre. He was kind of the prototypical hermit monk. So he lived from 480 to 547, and his followers kind of adopted the monastic lifestyle of, closing yourself up in a monastery and, working secluded to the glory of God. This is Francis of Assisi. He's lived from 1181 to 1226. Very strong opponent of corruption in the church, venerated poverty. He got approval from the Pope to kind of create his order. So that's where the Franciscans come from. We have Augustine of Hippo. He was quite old again, from 400 roughly. Well, actually born in 354 and died in 430. His order didn't actually start, though, until 1244, but they kind of followed his teachings. Can anybody name a famous Augustinian monk?
Martin Luther.
Yay! Yeah, that was Martin Luther. He wrote about grace, which kind of makes sense that Luther would be attracted to that order. And now this is going way in the future here, but kind of jumping ahead. But Ignatius of Loyola. Does anybody know what region he's from? Nobody? So he was Spanish, and he was from a area called Navarre. So that's the Basque land that kind of straddles France and Spain. Navarro is generally what you'll see now from people who are from that region from the Spanish side, and Navarre is what you see from people who are on the French side. I have relatives who are stone carvers, or ancestors who were stone carvers, and we have some of their tools that they brought back from Europe, and they were on the French side, so some of the tools say Navarre, but then they had some of their tools made on the Spanish side, so they'll say Navarro. They couldn't. So anyway, Ignatius of Loyola started the Jesuits. And so they are very well known for evangelization and education. Yeah.
And then the Jesuits were formed to counter the Reformation.
Very much so. Yeah. Yeah. Does anybody know the difference between a friar and a monk? Just a little trivia. So a monk, there's some overlap, but in general, a monk goes into seclusion. So a monastery is kind of by definition sealed off from the outside world. So the only monks are those who belong to an order that is like the Benedictines and the Augustinians, who are not out and about in society. If you take an order, but you are out and about in society, with some exceptions, you're generally a friar. And so we non-Catholics tend to use monk a little too freely. Very often when we think of monks, we're actually talking about friars, unless we're specifically in a monastery.
But Luther was a monk, yes?
Oh, yes. So, but he was Augustinian. So they were Augustinians and Benedictines.
But he was also out in the public, so.
Well, that's where it gets a little tricky. But that was also part of the problem why he got into stress with the church. In theory, he probably shouldn't have been. And really when he was in his monk days, that was when he was beating himself up in his cell. That wasn't when he was out preaching his ideas. But yeah, that was actually one of the conflicts once he started to become recognized, that became incompatible with the Augustinian life. So I mention orders in this context because orders really had the potential to be a disruptive force and had the potential to cause a schism. And the way that didn't happen, or the reason it didn't happen, is because orders were often kind of sponsored by a pope. When an order was formed, the orders that survived were the ones that politically got in favor with the pope. And so as long as the order didn't threaten the pope, it usually worked out. But even today, when you go into the politics of the Roman Catholic Church, a lot of the disputes can be traced down to disputes between orders. Power plays between orders, and different opinions about even doctrine in some cases, but certainly how the church should be run. So that's something we don't hear a lot about in our world, is that intrigue that's going on between orders. It is definitely a case of a area where there is potential stress and division. I want to talk about an order that you haven't heard of before, I'm guessing, the Humiliati, from humility, that's where the word comes from. That was started by, well, what happened was there were some noblemen in Lombardy. Those are the noblemen on the right there. They got kind of caught up in a rebellion, and they were captured and kind of sent to Germany, more or less arrested, and sent to Germany where they wouldn't cause any problems. In Germany, they decided to give themselves to the works of charity, and they were able to convince the emperor that they were no risk anymore. So they were allowed to return, and they formed an order. And this order became a big deal. Everybody in that part of the world knew about that order. They had, and it went on for hundreds of years. They had connections to the cloth trade, and they started to gather material possessions, so they became very wealthy. And they did things like limit the number of people who could join the order. So they had lots of money and few people to use that money on. And so things kind of got a little bit out of control, and the Archbishop of Milan was sent in to kind of sort things out, get them back to the straight and narrow. Well, he used quite a bit of force to try to get them to find the path. And one of the people in the order tried to have him murdered. And so that was when the order was just disbanded and the land was given away. So this is a case where an order did cause a big division in the church. And so, we only kind of hear about the history of the orders that survive today, and what we often hear is kind of a sanitized version of the history of that order, if we hear anything at all. Yeah?
Another question. What about the Cathars? Were they ever an order?
I believe that Cathars were lay people. And one of the things that most of the popes were really against was having a lay-based order. I may not have that completely right with the Cathars, but there were a bunch of movements that felt an awful lot like an order, but never quite got papal blessing.
And they were severely punished.
Exactly. Yes. Go ahead.
Are you gonna talk about when women started orders? When did that begin to happen?
Wasn't going to talk about that because the main reason is the women's orders generally did not cause a lot of conflict. So it didn't really fit in with my theme. But again, we could talk for days and days about that. The ones that we were just talking about, the Humiliati, they actually had order of nuns, and they lived on after the monastery was just, the male monks were, or male members of the order were dispersed. So that lived on for quite a long time. I'm trying to remember when the first, so like when we go back to Germany and what's her name? Hildegard von Bingen. She started out in a monastery. They didn't actually call it a convent, but she was definitely in a female order. and then it kind of became its own thing. So, I mean, I can't tell you the first time, but it's been close to 1,000 years that women have their own orders. And sometimes they're a spin-off from a male order, and sometimes they're completely separate. But, you know, I found this chart of all of these orders that have, you know, disbanded or were removed or what have you. And the incredible number of women's orders, the vast majority of them did not have any conflict, they just faded away. Whereas a lot of the male orders, something happened that made it not tenable to keep it around anymore. So, sorry, I'm not really answering your question, but that's about as good as I can do. So, besides the orders, of course, there's a whole ton of heretical movements. There's Peter Waldo. Oh, wait, that's not right. Peter Waldo. Waldo began, well, and I should say heretical movements, you can find all kinds of pages that talk about that using that term. A heretical heresy is kind of in the eye of the beholder. The Catholic Church, Roman Catholic Church, has done an extremely good job of applying their terminology to past events in church history. But Peter Waldo was, let's see, in the 1100s in Lombardy again, preached about the value of poverty. And by 1170 had a large number of followers. He preached against purgatory. He wanted the gospel in local language. He preached against prayers for the dead and preached against indulgences. So you can hear a lot of echoes to what would eventually become the Protestant Reformation. Waldo was also a lay person, and his followers were lay people. And again, that was something that really was a bridge too far for the powers that be. So he was excommunicated. But he and his followers kind of went to the mountains and managed to survive. And there is still a Waldenian movement that exists. You can find Waldenians in Italy, in Germany. There's a couple in the US, like North Carolina. There used to be a Waldenian church in New York. And so there are a lot of people we can kind of point to that said these Reformation ideas, they were brewing for a very long time. And they were probably more well-known than we might think, given how church history tends to talk about them. You know, the old phrase, history is written by the victors. Well, to a large extent, church history was written by, you know, especially before Reformation, was written by the Roman Catholics. And so when there were ideas that they didn't like, they did everything they could to destroy any evidence that those ideas existed. And it's only fairly recently that Roman Catholic scholars, you know, will acknowledge them and look at them with more of an even hand. But you still see things like, you know, putting it in the terminology of heresy. Yeah, so let me keep going here. I could talk about dozens and dozens and dozens of these little branches, but suffice it to say, there was enough of them that this was a threat to the church, and so that was one of the reasons that the Inquisition started. We have a rare photograph of the Spanish Inquisition. I bet you didn't expect that. Now, we have some funny ideas about the Inquisition. The vast majority of sentences that the Inquisition handed out was penance. So, they weren't completely on this, unbelievable murder spree. However, it is definitely true that if you were Jewish and if you refused to recant and if you were at the wrong place at the wrong time, it was going to end badly. But the Inquisition was really set up to try to stamp out what they viewed as heresies. And they were really pretty effective at it. Again, not necessarily by burning everyone at the stake, but by, lots of different levels of persuasion. Stop there for a minute. Any other thoughts or questions? Yeah.
I read a biography of Queen Isabella, and the book spent quite a lot of time on the Inquisition, and it mentioned the political underpinnings of the Inquisition as well. So it was kind of a joint venture between the politicians and the church.
Absolutely. I mean, one of the things we've seen in other contexts on earlier days is just this idea of, if you're emperor, it's a whole lot easier if all of your subjects are worshiping exactly the same way in this, and are following the same structure. And so there was a huge political advantage to keeping everybody on the same page. And I think there's another element, which is when you have revolutionary ideas concerning religion, it's not a very far leap to having revolutionary ideas in politics. And so I think many, many rulers felt it was just good business to try to get everybody on the same page, worshiping in the same way. And that was, Spain was probably the place that we know the most for really enforcing that. But it was a thing all over the Roman Catholic world.
One of the tortures that was developed or used during the Inquisition is what we today call waterboarding.
Yes.
Recent history of us.
No, and I mean, I'm sure that's absolutely true. Like I say, I think we blow it out of proportion, but it did happen. So what does that mean? I don't know. Other questions or thoughts? All right, so there was the Great Schism, but then there was the Western Great Schism. So that's 1378, 1417. Just a little bit of background here. So in the 12th and the 13th century, so before the Western Great Schism, that was probably when the papacy was at its height. It was really hard to distinguish religious matters from matters of state. The Pope wielded enormous power. An example are the Crusades. We kind of think of the English monarch leading a group to, the Holy Land. It's probably not unfair to say that the Pope was saying, you go, and the monarch basically acted as a general. The monarchs at this time could not afford to be completely independent from the power of the Pope. So when the Pope said jump, they said how high. Sometimes there was common interest between a monarch and the Pope, but other times the monarch just really needed the support of the Pope, so pretty much did what the Pope said. So that was kind of the state in most of Western Europe until we get to Philip IV of France. Whoops, that's not the right picture. That's Philip IV of France. He was the ruler in France from 1285 to 1314. He's kind of credited with taking France from very much a feudal system, where there was an enormous amounts of local power, and kind of turning it into more centralized government. And the way he did that was by kind of ruling with an iron fist. So he had lots of wars. Wars are always great for consolidating power. We've seen that in our recent history, right? But wars cost money, and so he racked up enormous debts. He first tried to kind of shake down the local fiefdoms and you know the rich people in his country. But then he kind of realized that you know who has more money than even we do? That's the church. So he started going after the church. At first, he just kind of said to the Pope, help me out here. And the Pope kind of did. They sent money. I think, you know, the Pope saw some of his wars as being good wars from the Pope's perspective. So money started to flow from the papal coffers to France, but it wasn't enough. And so Philip IV, as he always did, kept on dialing up the pressure. And so he levied taxes on the French clergy that were equivalent to half of their income. And that's when the church kind of drew a line in the sand. And so Pope Boniface, the eighth, he decreed, it is necessary to salvation that every human creature be subject to the Roman pontiff. So he was trying to lay down the law. And then the King of France said, your venerable conceitedness may know that we are nobody's vassal in temporary matters. So he wasn't having any of it. So this kind of blew up into a big thing. And so the King of France sent some Italian allies to break into the papal residence. And now we have a kind of a disagreement as to what happened. By some accounts, the Pope kind of barely escaped and was injured in the process. By other accounts, the Italian allies of the King of France just beat him up. The net result, though, was that the Pope didn't live long after that. He was injured enough and he died fairly quickly. So then the next Pope that was elected was Benedict the 11th. He didn't live very long, ostensibly of natural causes, but before he died, he absolved King Philip of any wrongdoing. Then the next Pope was Pope Clement V. Now, he was French and a friend of the king. So at this point, the French basically kind of took over in terms of the politics of Rome and got their man elected. And this is when the Pope moved out of Rome and went to Avignon. So it went to France. So there's disagreements as to why that happened. Some people say, well, he was just a puppet of the French king. Other people say, well, it had more to do with just how bad Rome was at the time. It was a dangerous place to be for a pope. There were lots of intrigues. The politics were incredibly bad. The corruption was off the charts. And so there are some who are like, well, no, this was more to kind of save the papacy and make things run more smoothly. So there's a whole bunch of popes over about 70 years or so who were centered in Avignon, and pretty much the entire church recognized those popes. There wasn't much of a problem there. Pope Gregory XI returned to Rome in 1376. So why did he return? Well, he went to kind of solve some of the problems in Italy. That's at least what some people say. The Pope in Florence were in open conflict, so he wanted to get closer to take care of that. At one point, the Pope excommunicated the whole city, which probably didn't work out so well for him because then the city stopped paying their ecclesiastical taxes. But he's back there, then Gregory died, and when Gregory died, then The Romans were like, okay, we're done with this French Pope thing. They broke into the voting chamber and forced an Italian to be elected Pope. The Italian Pope was elected, but then the French cardinals said, no, we're not doing this. So they created their own conclave and elected their own Pope. So that's when we got a Pope in Rome and a Pope in Avignon. And I'll just do one more thing and we'll wrap up here. So this chart you can kind of see, but you can see that there's 3 lines. So lots of people wanted to reconcile. Having 2 popes was no good for anybody. It wasn't good for the church. It wasn't good, it was just a bad idea. So the plan that the kind of moderates who wanted to bring things together, the plan they had was, well, we'll just elect a 3rd pope and everybody will agree. But they elected the 3rd pope and nobody agreed. So now instead of 2 popes, we have 3 popes. So the end result of this was of this whole period was a real weakening of the church. It started to be looked at by some people as this is kind of a farce. The other thing that happened was just corruption went through the roof. If you ever go to Avignon, you can see the extravagance that the popes there lived in. So it was a real hit for the church. It marked a decline in morality. There's a lot of arguments as to what caused what, and definitely a decline in discipline in the church. And so this is kind of setting the stage for more conflict and the Reformation. And I'm going to end there. Thank you.